We're now going to go to a presentation from CodeGuard, the CEO of CodeGuard, David Moeller. And he's got a company which is a leading provider of cloud website backup and malware remediation services. He's going to tell us a little bit about tools to guide your thinking around new technology adoption and product launches. And his presentation is entitled The Technology Adoption Lifecycle and Hybrid Corn Seed. I'm very curious to find out more about what is hybrid corn seed. David Moeller, please come and join us on stage.
Hello. For those who are still here, I'm very excited. Can you guys hear me okay? Fantastic. So I'm very excited to talk today about the technology adoption lifecycle and hybrid corn seed. And you may be wondering what hybrid corn seed from the 1930s has to do with technology adoption, and very soon you will learn. So we're going to start with the present. So this S-curve represents technology adoption over the last 100 years. And you can see that on the left side of the graph, with the telephone and electricity, that it took a number of years for that technology to be adopted such that it was ubiquitous. And you can see that as we get closer to the present day, those S-curves go from what is the logistic function to something that looks like a straight line. And what's happening is technology is being adopted much quicker. So I wanted to start with the present, because we're going to be spending some time talking about the past with hybrid corn seed, so you can have a good understanding of where we're going to get to at the end of this. So now we're going to go back in time a little bit. Does anyone recognize these pictures? Does anyone know where these pictures are from? Anybody? So this is Europa Park in 1985, and this is Europa Park in 2017. So the first time I actually visited Europa Park, I was 6 years old. We were stationed in Augsburg for about 3 years, and the first time that I ever visited Europa Park was way before World Hosting Days and CloudFest. So I just wanted to show you guys this to tell a little bit about myself. This was way before I co-founded CodeGuard, and before I went to business school at Harvard, and before I studied engineering. And I thought this would be a little bit more interesting for everyone in the audience. So now I'll tell you a little bit about CodeGuard. We're known for world-class backup. We back up over 500,000 websites and databases around the world for hundreds of thousands of customers. But we do much more than that. So we have a malware product that's patented, where we remove malware from our backups. We'll automatically update plugins for our customers. We also offer website migration and advanced features for web pros. So that's a little bit about us. And these are some of our partners. So we partner with shared hosting providers around the world, as well as VPS and dedicated hosts, and cloud service providers like Cloudflare. And they offer our services to their customers. OK. So let's get into the hybrid corn seed, because I know that you are all sitting literally on the edge of your seat in anticipation of what you're going to be able to learn. So we're going to talk a little about the corn seed, diffusion of innovations, the BAS model, and then how this can be used to model the future. OK, so we're going to get right into it. In 1936, from 1936 to 1939, something happened in the United States where 2/3 of all farmers started adopting this new type of corn seed. And they went from, the farming acreage went from about 40,000 acres to 400 million. So over a period of 3 years. Now this is also right on the tail end of the Depression in the United States. And at the time, this was the most advanced technology that was being adopted throughout the United States. And so if we had taken our original S-curve, we could have put the adoption of corn seed on there. There were 2 individuals at Iowa State University that did a study on the diffusion of this hybrid seed corn, because they wanted to understand, how did it spread so fast, or did it really spread so fast? And we're going to kind of look into some of the data on it. Because this corn seed was technology that was very essential in that it was more drought resistant. And so you have a technology, I mean, we have our Android or our iPhone devices, and maybe we get the iPhone X, and you take a little bit of a better picture. But this is technology that's going to feed people better. And for farmers, it's their livelihood. And so to me, it's very fascinating because I don't think that there is a technology. We could look at medical technology as well and how it's adopted. But if you think about a technology people should be adopting and that should spread, it's something that's going to help their livelihood or help feed people. So these two guys study this, and they're sociologists. And what they looked at is they looked at the impact that salesmen, neighbors, farm journals, and radio advertising had on the spread of this corn seed. Because, again, from 1936 to 1939, you have 2/3 of all farmers who start implementing this new corn seed. So what they found is the following, and this chart shows when farmers first heard about the corn seed and when they accepted it and started implementing it. So the columns in white are when they first heard, and then the gray is when they first accepted it. So you can see there's a 6-year period from peak hearing about the corn seed before it was actually used. And again, this isn't an iPhone or a piece of superfluous technology. This is going to put food on the table. And so it's somewhat intriguing that even for this very impactful technology, it still took 6 years before the farmers were going to adopt it broadly. The next chart shows, on this left side, the percentage of farmers who first heard about it and what channel they heard about it. And then on the right side, oh wow, that's tough to see a little bit. On the right side, I'll read the title for you. That is the percentage of farm operators who first accepted it and the channel that drove them to accept it. So on this side, you can see the green line starts very high. And that's salesmen who are influencing the farmers. And you'll see that over time, that green line drops and the red line goes up, and that's the neighbors. Now on this side, that's the influence to actually use the corn seed. And you can see the sales line, which is green, starts high, and then the neighbors eclipses it pretty rapidly. And so this next chart gives you the numerical breakdown of what that prior graph showed, which is that of the original knowledge, salesmen represented about 50% of how the farmers first heard about this new corn seed. But as far as influencing the use of the corn seed, it was actually the neighbors in that second column at 45% who had the greatest impact. So again, this is all a study about hybrid corn seed from the 30s. And now we're going to show some of the cohorts. So this is the median percentage of the corn acreage that the farmers were using. So let's say you have a farm and you're going to try some new corn seed. You probably wouldn't try it for your entire crop, because if it doesn't work, then you have nothing to sell and your family is going to be even hungrier than they were before. So in 1930, if we take the 1934 cohort, it took them about 6 years before they had completely converted to 100% corn seed. You'll see in 1940, it only took 2 years. So what's happening here is that this new technology is not just being tested, but it's being trusted much, much faster. Okay. So we've talked a little about some corn seed. Well, how do we get to the technology adoption life cycle? How do we get to anything meaningful from this? Well, Everett Rogers is the one who looked at this corn seed study, and he was fascinated by the diffusion of innovations. Part of the reason he was fascinated is that his dad was a farmer. And in 1936, there was a drought, and his father did not use hybrid corn seed. In 1937, his father did use hybrid corn seed after looking at all of his neighbors' farms that had these, tall stalks of corn growing. So Everett was very focused, and he had very significant ties to what was happening with the corn, and I think it started fascinating him from a young age. So he looked at innovations across, not just from a sociology perspective, but he looked at medicine. He looked at I would say like 5 to 10 different sectors, not just rural agriculture. And he put together his theory of innovations. And so what he took from the hybrid corn seed study was that the spread of the corn seed had to do with the individuals who were using it, and he broke them into the buckets that we know today as the technology adoption life cycle. So the innovators, the 5 buckets are the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. And I'd say that probably everyone in this room has seen this graph. Everyone's seen this graph. You probably didn't know this graph came from Everett Rogers and his review of the corn seed. So that's where this came from. And he looked at those innovators, and the same thing that those farmers had is the same thing that innovators today have in common. So the innovators, what made them different than all the other groups is that they have the financial flexibility to test this new product, to test the hybrid corn seed, while they still hedge with the rest of their farm. And as the corn seed became more proven, then you have the early majority and the late majority that are going to adopt it because they can now take that risk because others have reduced have proven out this new technology. So this is Everett Rogers, and he published his paper on the diffusion of innovations based on the hybrid corn seed, and his approach was a softer approach from the sociology standpoint. So how do we get to something that's applicable or useful? So I will now introduce Frank Bass and the Bass model. One of Frank's students approached him and said, I've heard this guy Everett Rogers talking about this diffusion of innovation. It seems like an interesting concept, and he thinks that the bell curve is the right approximation for how adoption is driven. What do you think about this? And Frank Bass said, well, I think that an ordinary differential equation might be able to explain what's happening. And he just said, I think that model might make sense. And he was right that the model did make sense. And so what we have is a formula that on the right side we have Q that's multiplied by the installed base fraction. And Q and P are the two key coefficients. So we have a coefficient of innovation, which is P, and imitation, which is Q. And what's so beautiful about this equation, if you think about the spread of a new technology where individuals play a role, Q is multiplied by the install base, which are the people who are currently using it. So if you think about something that has great word of mouth, it'll have a very high Q. Now we can have a product that does not have strong word of mouth, but has lots of marketing behind it, and that's going to have a very high P, because P is not a function of how many people are already using it. So this is the differential equation that Bass thought would approximate how technology was adopted, and he was right. So we're going to take, on the bottom right-hand corner, it's a little hard to see, this is a study done in 2013 of 175 different social media services and web services. And we've got P and Q graphed. So P is on the x-axis, and Q is on the y-axis. So let's say we were all just having a conversation or having a beer, and we wanted to hypothesize, and I gave you 8 choices of services and said, which one of these do you think has a high Q or high P? And those options were Amazon, eBay, Facebook, MySpace, Twitter, YouTube, Google+, and Craigslist. Okay, so those are your options. So we'll do a little informal survey. Are there any of those options that anyone in this audience thinks, and it's not a trick question, you're not going to be embarrassed, are there any of those options that someone thinks might have a very high P, which is the coefficient of innovation? Any of those services? Anyone want to hazard a guess? If any of those, or this might be too new at this point. So I'll kind of get to the punchline. That yellow dot, I'm going to point to over here, there's a yellow dot right about 0.015. That's Google+. So they launched this, and the goal, I guess, initially was to try to take on Facebook, and pushed it through incredible distribution channels. Does anyone in here use it? Okay, we actually have a hand. That's fantastic. So they pushed really, really, really hard on it, but there was not the word of mouth that was anywhere close to these other services that are listed. So you can see that distribution, and that clumping illustrates the explanatory power of the Bass model. And there are a couple other differential equations, and we'll get to those in just a second. Okay, so what is the usefulness of all of this? Are we just going to sit and have a fun discussion about math, or is there any applicability? So one thing you can do is you can now explain the past by modeling correctly from a statistically significant standpoint how these different services have grown. So how would that be useful to anyone in the audience? Well, depending on either the sector that you're in or thinking about getting in, you can look at the data. And this study was done in 2013, and what they did is they used Google Trends for these social media services because they found that a third of all users of social media services will put in Google the term. So if they go to log in Facebook, they'll search Facebook. So they were able to correlate weekly usage, and that's how they pulled the data for weekly usage for these different services. And so as I mentioned, there are several different diffusion models that you can use to map the growth of these services. So in 2013, if we look at Facebook, it's at a pretty high peak. And so it would be somewhat bold in 2013 to predict that Facebook is going to have a decline in usage. Well, that's what they did. They predicted that by now, and the different models ranged on how pessimistic the future growth or decline would be. And I think last quarter, Facebook announced their first non-consecutive growth. So we now have this really interesting and powerful framework to look at technology adoption that started with hybrid corn seed in the 30s, which was this revolutionary technology in the United States, and truly impacted and changed lives. As we saw from that, even with something that everyone needed, it took 6 years, and you have sales and marketing playing a crucial role. So at CodeGuard, we're very, very focused from an engineering standpoint, and I'm absolutely fascinated that there are technology improvements that people need, such as the corn seed, that still you have sales and marketing that plays an absolutely essential role to get the word out. But then you have the secondary effect, word of mouth, where your customers start using the product, and then they start to refer others, and they both play an essential role. So that concludes my presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it, and if you have any questions, I'll be available afterwards. And probably most importantly, I hope you had a fun time last night at the Come to Gather party. And tomorrow night, we're sponsoring the Connection party. And if you haven't yet done it, you can go to our booth to putt for the MacBook. And that's all I have. Thank you.
David Moeller, ladies and gentlemen. David, stay on the stage. I have some questions for you. So we all know a lot about corn seed. I learned a lot of things there. I'd always thought, and obviously I was misinformed, that the technology adoption curve was designed by Geoffrey Moore.
Geoffrey Moore is a fantastic individual, and he talks about crossing the chasm.
Yes.
And it's really interesting because in Crossing the Chasm, he doesn't reference growth. He doesn't talk about Neil. You don't see the foundation of where some of the beginnings are. And Moore is fantastic as you think about the keys to driving adoption from a technology standpoint, really how you can implement it. So he's lighter on the theory, which really started in this diffusion of innovations, but he's much more heavy on the practicality. And so I'm a big fan of Moore, but yes, it's fascinating. He actually doesn't have a single reference cited in his book from a sort of academic reference standpoint.
How many of you here have read Crossing the Chasm by Geoffrey Moore? One. It's considered to be one of the Bibles of technology adoption, but I learned right now from David that the curve, that bell-shaped curve, wasn't actually his work. He's taken it further.
He's absolutely taken it and addressed a very key aspect, which is after you get those innovators in the door, you're reaching a completely different group as you think about the mass market, and their motivations for buying and how they're going to buy is completely different. And we've seen that at CodeGuard. I mean, when we first started in 2011, the customers who are willing to give us a try then are very different than the customers who, it's not hard to trust a company that's working with almost every large public hosting company in the world and has hundreds of thousands of customers. The trust you need in the beginning days is very different. So Jeff does a great job of really differentiating and explaining how you go from those innovators to the mass market, because many companies have failed where they do really well in the very early stages and then fail to really go to the next gap. I was talking to the CEO of a company called Dimbala, which raised about $100 million, maybe a little less. And this is a couple years ago. He's Val Romani, incredible CEO. And she said, one of our challenges was that when we started, we built out so much for our early customers, and we did so much customization of that product that we never made it to everyone else because we just kept building for these testers, these innovating companies that have the R&D budgets and have the manpower. And they ultimately stumbled and sold for a fraction of what they raised because they did not successfully get to that mass market.
So what are the key barriers to adoption for high technology? What are the keys that are going to help these guys with the new technology jump that chasm, cross the chasm?
So that is a great question. Part of it is identifying who you're going after, what segment are we going after, and then aligning the sales and marketing budget to that sector. Many companies that overspend while they're trying to bridge from the innovators to the mass market, don't understand that you have to develop a certain level of trust, and oftentimes you just need time. So Nassim Taleb talks about anti-fragility. It's a phenomenal concept that just talks about how, or it expresses that the longer that a business is in existence, the more, and it's not robust, any stressor it encounters that allows the business to continue makes it stronger. And that is absolutely the case, and for someone who's trying to bridge the chasm, oftentimes they just need to be patient and continue to build up reference customers, because oftentimes there is no shortcut. If the mass market is going to buy for a fundamentally different reason than the innovators, there oftentimes is nothing you can do other than to wait until you have the credibility that the mass market is willing to buy. And so oftentimes, and the key to that, if you're a startup, is you can't overspend, or you need to raise enough that can sustain you to that point. So we think of like a Cloudflare. So Cloudflare in the early days, we're a Cloudflare partner. I went to business school with Matthew and Michelle. And in 2011, Akamai is not going to view Cloudflare as a competitor, as a threat. Enterprises aren't flocking to Cloudflare, and they're now valued at $1 billion. And enterprises are incredibly willing to go use their product. So I think that's a good example of someone who you're going to start at a certain place, and they started. I mean, I don't want to get too off of this side, but they started providing a free service to anyone, and accumulated millions of websites, and then went to the enterprise because the robustness of their offering was so much greater. Had they started the other way, who knows if they'd still be in existence if you try to earn trust with the enterprise first, and it's worked out splendidly for them.
So what you're saying is, in summary, those segments, the visionaries, early adopters before we jump the chasm to the early majority, it's almost like selling into different markets, because the buying psychology is different to a visionary who's not frightened about risk. He just wants the new, latest, sexiest thing. And when you cross the chasm, he said, yeah, but does it work? Who else is using it? How much does it cost? He's making pragmatic P&L sort of decisions about it, and the other guy doesn't worry about it. So there's almost two different sales arguments or sales positionings or messaging positionings necessary to appeal to the different psychics of it.
Two completely different sales messages, and you think about the coefficient of imitation Q, it's all about that base of customers who talk to each other. And so the innovators will talk to each other. And the most innovative companies, when they're hiring the same employees, the Googles and the Facebooks, where they're hiring, and each cohort, those companies that talk to each other, you have to have the reference customers, or there is no Q to be multiplied by something, and there's no word of mouth to spread. So being very focused on which segment you're going after, the buying behavior for that segment, and then addressing them properly.
Fabulous. And all that came from Corn Seed.
Corn Seed.
What an interesting journey we've been on. David Moeller, CEO of CodeGuard.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.